Hello, everybody. Hello and welcome to this Frontiers in Science deep dive, exploring whether foods made by combining alternative protein sources like plants, fungi, insects, cell-cultivated meat can indeed provide healthier, tastier, more sustainable alternatives to animal products. My name is Greg Foote. Hello, I'm your moderator for today's session, and it is absolutely fantastic to see viewers from over 82 countries watching this. I can see you're all in the chat: Spain, Portugal, Poland, Germany, Uganda, Romania, Colombia. It's a huge long list. Welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Thank you very much for being here. Today's webinar presents the Frontiers in Science lead article led by Professor David Julian McClements and Professor David Kaplan. And we could not be prouder to give their article and its hub a home here at Frontiers in Science. We're going to start by kicking off and hearing from Professor McClements and Professor Kaplan. Then I will welcome three other fantastic experts to join us, they will all form a stellar panel to answer your questions. Before we begin though, if you don't know much about Frontiers in Science, let me give you a quick bit of background about us. Frontiers in Science is our flagship multidisciplinary open access journal at Frontiers. The journal focuses on commissioning exceptional peer-reviewed lead articles from world-leading researchers on the transformational science that is key to accelerating solutions to global, human and planetary health challenges. Then, around each of those articles, we build a unique hub of multi-audience content, viewpoints, editorials, policy articles, content for children and the general public, and then we maximize the dissemination of that content via large-scale communication campaigns. It's all designed to extend the journal's reach and impact across science, policy and society. To date, we've published 25 hubs spanning over 90 articles that cover a diverse spectrum of transformational science. The science has been cited over 900 times. It's been downloaded around 300,000 times. It's been viewed over 2 million times, and it's been regularly picked up in top media. We're really, really proud to be driving innovation in publishing so that critical, transformational, open science has the potential to reach everyone and accelerate scientific progress for all. Today, as I said, we're focusing on the Frontiers in Science lead article, which has the title Hybrid Alternative Protein-Based Foods, Designing a Healthier and More Sustainable Food Supply. It was published just under a month ago in late September. We know that current food systems, especially industrial animal agriculture, are major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, land and water use, and biodiversity loss. And there have been concerns raised around its impact on our health and our food security. As both our population and the global demand for protein rises, there is growing interest in finding alternative sources that are not only more sustainable and ethical, but also nutritionally adequate and appealing to consumers. Now, as we will hear today, no single alternative protein source meets all these criteria. So researchers are exploring hybrid protein-based foods, innovative combinations of plant, fungal, microbial, insect or cultivated cell proteins designed to balance health, sustainability and consumer acceptance. In their Frontiers in Science lead article, the authors examine the potential of these hybrid protein foods, outlining their benefits, their challenges and future directions. And that is exactly what we're going to be discussing together today. I'm really, really excited to explore this. Let me introduce you to the rest of the article hub. So alongside the lead article, you've also got an editorial by Dr. Francesco Branca from University of Geneva, Switzerland. You've got two viewpoint articles this time, one by Professor Michael Gidley from the University of Queensland, Australia, and another by Professor Mark Post from Maastricht University and Francesco Zacharian from Mozambique, both in the Netherlands. There are also two policy outlooks by Dr. Helena Wright of the FAIRR Initiative in the UK and Dr. Alessandro Monaco and Professor Kai Purnhagen from the University of Bayreuth in Germany. I'm not finished yet, because alongside the scientific articles in the hub, you're also going to find a lay explainer, infographics, a video, and an article in Frontiers for Young Minds, which is our brilliant, brilliant journal for kids. I recommend you go and check that out. So there is lots to dive even deeper into later, but not now, because now we're going to get into this deep dive. I'm soon to be joined by Professor David Julian McClements and Professor David Kaplan, the lead authors of this article. And I'd like to introduce the panelists who will be joining them later. We're going to be joined by Professor Kai Purnhagen, the co-author of one of the policy outlooks I just mentioned, Dana Wilson from the FAIRR Initiative, and Dr Dariush Ajami from Beyond Meat. Let me give our two lead article authors the introduction that I'm sure you will agree they very much deserve. Professor David Julian McClements is a distinguished professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the US, and one of the world's most highly cited food scientists, internationally recognized for advancing sustainable, healthy food innovations that bridge science, technology, and public health. Julian's work spans plant-based and hybrid protein systems, food nanotechnology, and the delivery of bioactive compounds. And he has published over 1,700 scientific articles and multiple influential books. Julian is a fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry, the American Chemical Society, the Institute of Food Technologists, and he serves as editor of the Annual Review of Food Science and Technology. Professor David Kaplan is the Stern Family Endowed Professor of Engineering and Chair of the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Tufts University in the US, Director of the NIH Tissue Engineering Resource Center, and he serves as the Editor-in-Chief of ACS Biomaterials Science and Engineering. His research focuses on biopolymer engineering, tissue engineering, regenerative medicine, and cellular agriculture, with a special emphasis on silk-based biomaterials. David has authored over 1,000 peer-reviewed papers. He is also a fellow of the American Institute of Medical and Biomedical Engineering, the National Academy of Inventors, and the National Academy of Engineering, recognized for his transformative contributions to biomedical science. I think you agree these are two incredible, incredible scientists joining us. Thank you, Julian and David, for bringing this important work to Frontiers in Science. The floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you, Greg. I'm going to start us off a little bit with some context and background. And I also want to just bring greetings from Boston from both Julian and myself, and welcome everybody to the discussions today. So briefly, I think to set the stage, it's good to just take a look back and understand the motivation behind the article and today's discussions, which is illustrated here in two aspects. One is the concern that the population on the planet continues to grow, and estimates are somewhere in the next 20 years to 30 years, we're going to hit 10 billion people from our current 8 billion. So we have a lot of work to do to feed that many new mouths on the planet. And estimates are we're gonna have to increase food production by a significant amount, particularly protein-rich foods, to meet that demand. Something where resources and available sort of technologies today are going to have difficulty to do. And this population also is driven both because of the increased economic status and more sort of urban center centric populations, which lead to further strains on our food supply. And therefore, alternatives that allow more people equitable access to food that's food rich in protein and nutrients is really compelling to make sure we're all living on a healthy planet while we're also consuming these foods. So one thing is the logical response to all this would be just tell people to consume less protein rich foods like beets, because this would be one way to forestall the inevitable demand that we cannot meet with current sort of technologies. The problem is this just doesn't work. As people become more economically viable in terms of their status, they want to eat more meat. That's a recurring correlation that you see throughout human history. And number two, with the population growth that we're seeing, the demand just keeps going up, as we said. So we need to start looking at alternative ways to fill this void. And this is built on not only the issues of population growth, but environmental, health, and ethical drivers that really bring us all to the table and try and figure out how to find new technologies, these alternative sources of proteins, to meet this growing demand that we're going to have a difficult time to fill. So briefly, from the environmental standpoint, the issues are right now, if we just look at cows, because they're probably the prototypical worst case scenario, if you will, they're just extremely inefficient at sort of converting crops grown in the field into edible meats and foods that consumers want. And you can see that on the left, the yield for beef is extremely low, and you can see the progression as we look through other sources of meat towards the right-hand side with plants. So this is one compelling reason, finding more efficient ways to convert what we grow in the field into the biomass we consume as food, making sure it's safe and healthy and so on. And the same is true on the right-hand side. Beef particularly is a really problem area for greenhouse gases. So sustainable issues and carbon dioxide production and related gases are really extreme for beef. And these are areas, again, we can address with alternative foods. There are other issues, as we mentioned, such as health concerns. The most common examples are just things like the correlation between consuming cooked red meat, for one instance, with rising colon cancers and coronary heart disease, along with just increasing concerns with current meat production processes and how this just incredible number of livestock leads to a lot of challenges with how do we control disease states and the spread of disease. And so antibiotic resistance is a compelling challenge that we're all facing, a lot of it due to the general overuse. Estimates are 70 to 80% of all antibiotics used on the planet are just to keep our livestock safe enough to deter disease transmission. I think during recent COVID outbreaks, we also saw that a lot of these outbreaks were associated with some of the meat processing plants because of the concentration effects there. And also you see, general rules of things like bird flu, swine flu, that are happening everywhere on a regular basis lately. So these are all issues from a consumer health standpoint that we need to start to think about and look for alternative ways to generate some of this protein that can avoid or reduce some of these risks for human health. And that also applies to the ethical issues that we face as well in terms of housing these animals in very tight spots. So that leads to the next phase that Julian will take over, but basically we now have a series of different options to look at sort of the advancing technology to generate the protein that we need to supplant and in some cases perhaps replace some of the current sources of livestock meats. And those include the insects, the plants, the fungal systems, and also bioreactor derived ingredients, which could be cell culture or microbial sourced specialized precision proteins as well. So I'll turn it over to Julian.
Yeah, thanks very much, David, for highlighting some of the problems associated with getting our protein from meat. As David mentioned, there's all these other sources of protein that we can use to create different types of foods, and each one of these has its own advantages and disadvantages. So what we'll do, we'll start by looking at sort of plant-based foods, and these are probably the most successful alternative proteins at the moment, mainly because they're lower cost and it's very the plant-based ingredients are very abundant. And there's a whole series of different products. We can get plant-based meat, egg, dairy products, and seafood now. And there's some really good ones on the market. There's also some really bad ones on the market. But what we'll do in this talk, we'll just focus on the sort of meat products. So if we're trying to design, like a plant-based meat product, we want it to look and taste and feel just like real meat. And the reason we want to do this is because the vast majority of consumers in most countries are not vegetarians or vegans, they're actually omnivores. So they want to eat a product that looks at and tastes and feels like a real meat product. And to do that, we really need to use like reverse engineering techniques. We need to understand like how what type of molecules make up meat, how they interact with each other, and how that determines the characteristics of meat products. And then we want to try and simulate those characteristics using plant-based ingredients, which are often very different from the animal-based ingredients. So, for example, in plants, the proteins are often globular proteins, where in meat they're often sort of fibrous kind of proteins. And this is a really sort of exciting area to work in scientifically, but also incredibly complicated. You have to do sort of design of these kind of products and take into account what's the textural characteristics, how hard or soft are the products, and how can I mimic that using plant-based ingredients? What are the optical properties? So what does the product look like? And this depends on how light waves are absorbed and scattered by it. What does it taste like? And this depends on molecules that interact with sensors on your tongue and in your nose. And then how does it break down in your mouth and determine the mouthfeel? So there's a lot of sort of really hardcore engineering that has to go into this area in order to make plant ingredients behave like animal products, like meat or eggs or other ones. And probably the most common way of doing this at the moment in the food industry is to use different types of processing methods. And one of the most widely used methods is extrusion. And this is where you mix all the different ingredients together, the plant-based ingredients, and then you shear them and you put them under high temperature and pressure, and then you force them through a small die at the end. And that process causes fibrous structures to form in the product. And in the end, you can get something that has quite meat-like characteristics in terms of texture and flavor and appearance. But those techniques are, often you need a big sophisticated equipment and they can be quite energy intense. So it would be useful to have other ways of doing this as well. So in my lab and a lot of other labs around the world, people are using what's called soft matter physics approaches to try and create meat-like products out of plant-based ingredients. So for example, we can create adipose tissue from plant-based oils and proteins, so something that looks like animal fat, or we can create connective tissue and muscle tissue using plant-based ingredients. And again, there's a lot of science that goes into trying to make these kind of products. So for example, in my lab, we use a lot of what's called soft matter physics approaches, such as something called coactivation or thermodynamic incompatibility. And this is where you mix proteins and polysaccharides together, and then you control their interactions with each other to create certain kinds of structures. So in this example here, we've taken like pea proteins, and then we've heated them to form, under controlled conditions, to form these fibrous structures. And then we've mixed them with polysaccharides from fruits, so in this case, pectin. And when you mix them together, they actually phase separate. And you get one phase that's rich in proteins and one that's rich in pectin. And then if you shear that and set it, you can form these fibrous structures and get a product at the end of it that looks a lot like seafood or meat. So as I said, these are probably the biggest area is the plant-based meat area. And this has been was growing a lot up until about 2021, so around the COVID time. And then after that, it's declined recently. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. Probably the most important one is taste. Is these products don't taste as good as, or they don't taste exactly like a meat product. There's also been some concerns about health, in fact, that these are ultra-processed foods. And these products are often more expensive than the meat products they're designed to replace. So all of those different reasons in like a hard economic times means that the plant-based food industry has not continued to increase as it did in the past. And this is one of the reasons why maybe hybrid products could be better. Another area that we often don't think about is insect-based foods. These are not very common foods in the West, but around the globe, some like 2 billion people will eat insect-based foods. And in terms of sustainability and environmental impact, they're a lot better the source of proteins and nutrients than traditional meat like beef is. They're rich in proteins and healthy oils and minerals and dietary fiber. But many of us don't want to eat these, whole insects because of what's called the yuck factor. We're just not familiar with them and we find them disgusting. So one way to get around that is actually like disassemble the insect. So instead of eating the whole insect, we can break it down into different components and we can make like an insect flour, or we can isolate oils or proteins from it. And then we can combine those different ingredients together to form new products. So like a protein bar or other kinds of products. And the other thing, we talk about the yuck factor with insects. We don't think about the yuck factor with meat, but you're taking this animal that's walking around in a field, a healthy animal, and you're converting it into mincemeat. And I think we're all sort of used to that. And I think we have like a cognitive dissonance where we dissociate the animal in the farm from the meat on our plate. But, you know, just as we become familiar with eating beef, maybe we can do the same things with insects in the future. And there are some companies that are trying to do this. This is a company in Europe, which is making insect burgers and meatballs. So they're taking different types of insects, you know, grinding them up and then converting them into these burgers, which have got a very good nutritional profile, and you know, they've got a good taste if you can get over that yuck factor. So the last thing I'll talk about before switching to David is looking at some of these mycoprotein products. So this is a company in England called Quorn, and they use mycoprotein, which comes from myceliums. So what they do is, I actually visited this factory. It's based in my hometown in England. So I grew up in this town called Billingham, and this is where this factory is based. So it's on a big industrial estate. And when I visited them, they took like a small quantity of powder, and they sort of grow it up in a bioreactor and grow it up. And eventually you can get, you know, huge amounts of this sort of protein-rich and nutrient-rich material in these big sort of stainless steel bioreactors. And then you can take those, you can isolate them and turn them into a whole variety of different meat-like products, which, you know, I really like. We can buy them in our local supermarket in Massachusetts. Last year, I visited a company called Matcha Foods in Denmark. So they're based in Copenhagen. And what they do is they take sort of plant-based ingredients, so usually waste products from side streams from plants. And then they use those as a base, and they mix them with mycelium, and then they'll grow, they'll let them grow, and the mycelium will go use the plants as nutrients, and then they can create like meat-like products, which look something like this. And I tried some of these, and these are really nice products as well. So both of these use mycelium as a source of meat analogs. The Quorn products use what's called submerged fermentation. So they put the myceliums in, you know, sort of nutrient broth and grow them up in bioreactors. Whereas the Matcha products use solid state fermentation. So they just put the raw materials into these rooms, which have got a controlled environment, and then they'll grow up into these meat-like burgers. And one of the big advantages of these microproteins, as well as being very nutritious, they've also got this naturally got a fiber structure. So the mycelium are very thin fibers that behave somewhat like the fibers in meat. So they give the right texture and mouthfeel. So there's lots of different sources. Now I'll hand it over to David, who's much more of an expert than I am on sort of the different techniques that involve culture in different types of cells.
Great, thanks, Julian. Just to emphasize what Julian just covered, I mean, the whole idea is to move into biologically derived alt proteins that are not just plant, but also, as you just heard, fungal systems. And aside from very enriched fiber-based products, they can be done through lower processing. So you get away from ultra-processed foods. Generally, the nutrient content is very high. Fat content tends to be very low. Caloric content is also fairly low. And essential amino acids can be quite high as well. So these are really a good sort of direction to pursue as an alternative source, as is what you see here, which is basically what we term precision fermentation. But really, you're trying to use growing microorganisms, or in some cases, housing this in cells from plants and producing specialized proteins that can be added into the food production process to enhance specific factors. It could be nutritional content, it could be flavor and taste, and so on. Just depends on what the target is. So you could carry out these processes with bacteria, with fungi, with animal cells, if you wish. The example here is with soybeans. So producing, in this case, a heme protein through soybean production. So plant cropping of this value-added complex protein. The reason why heme is very valuable is because these kind of hemoglobin related complex molecules are really good when you add them to food, because when you cook them, the presence of the iron and the heme really give you more of an umami taste or a meat flavor that comes through in the process. So this has been perfected by some of the plant-based producers as well for value added in their products. But lots of different precision fermented products are being pursued. They are, for example, milk proteins and other specialized flavorants that are going into foods. Challenges remain, though. Scaling up the production and keeping costs down are always issues that have to be dealt with when using this approach for food-related additives. Other approaches that are being pursued from a biological perspective include, for example, genetically engineering these same plants that we're talking about, but now to produce other kinds of proteins from animals. So, for example, this particular company, Moolec, is trying to do so. I think they're based out of Luxembourg, if I recall. And what they do is in a couple of step process, they clone genes, in this case from a pig. Those genes are then expressed within soy plant beans, and those beans obviously can be cropped in the field, harvested, and the proteins used to make food-related products. So this is a way to essentially remove animals from the equation, but yet benefit from the components in meat from those animals that become sort of harvested along with the crops, and this becomes a more efficient, perhaps lower cost way to produce foods. This also gets away from ultra processing. It makes it a simpler step to make these food related products. And so these are available through this tech, and you could imagine almost any animal protein you might want to incorporate directly into plants to avoid, again, further processing. This would be a strategy to use as long as you're accepting of genetically modified plants, which depends on obviously region and culture and so on. But this is one way to move ahead on protein-rich foods with this alt protein approach through GMO. Another example that comes from our own lab and Andrew Stout's work is really to take, for example, a cow cell. This is a cow muscle cell that we used, and the cow cell was the recipient then of a series of genes that is involved in the production of beta carotene, which you know from carrots, so the orange color you see in a carrot. And the idea was to incorporate the series of 3 genes into the cow cells. So as you grow the cells to make meat, muscle tissue from the cow cells, that tissue, that meat would then be enriched in beta carotene, which is a very good antioxidant and a natural compound. And this proved to be useful on 2 fronts. One, the upside part of the process, because with raw meat or raw cells enriched in beta carotene, that means they're full of antioxidants. That means the shelf life is better, which means by the time you buy it and cook it in your home, the quality of the meat should be better as well, right? Because it's soaking up any oxidized proteins and lipids to prevent these problems from happening. On the downstream side, once you cook it, it turns out the level of antioxidant is higher than if you just tried to add this into the food as an extraneous additive. So the cells protect these otherwise sensitive molecules, and therefore the final food that you cook here was more enriched in the antioxidants themselves. So this is another strategy. Just like plant engineering, you could do livestock cell engineering to enhance these kinds of nutritional values and health values that would be really value added moving forward with this general approach to all proteins. And then the other, major effort, and this is something our lab spends a lot of time on, are cell-based meat analogs. And here the idea, working from left to right on this screen, is pick a source of your cells from whatever livestock you want to recapitulate, or it could be fish cells and so on. And those cells are isolated from the original animal, and then the animal is no longer in principle needed in the entire equation to produce food to the right. So there's a lot of cell biology here. You have to isolate cells, characterize them, make sure they propagate in long term into high biomass. You want to oftentimes immortalize the cells so they're consistent in quality, which is important for the regulatory side, and also consistent production processes. Usually you're after muscle and fat, muscle for structure and texture for the food you're going to make, the fat for the flavor and sensory parts of the meat. And then other cell types often might be connective tissue related cells and so on. Those cells have to be grown to high densities and high numbers, and that's often in some kind of bioreactor. You see 3 examples here. Still today, I think stirred tank is probably the most popular because it's a spillover from the pharmaceutical production industry, so it's well understood. Whether it's economically viable as scale up for the field remains to be determined. A lot of interest in hollow fiber technology, particularly if the hollow fibers themselves can be edible, so you can grow them into this structure, perfuse oxygen and nutrients through to get larger 3D materials produced, and this generates meat-like textures when you're done. And then there are rocky bed, which is basically a platform to move things back and forth. Sometimes they're called wave bioreactors as well. And then there's a lot of innovation in the field going on in different labs to try and look at new ways to scale up cell production from livestock to make food. And the challenge is very real because when you do this for pharmaceutical production, you're dealing with small volume products that are ultra pure. Here for food, it's the opposite, right? You're dealing with high volume products where the purity doesn't have to be quite as high for a medical procedure, still has to be good, but the price has to be very low to compete with consumer wishes. And then a lot of this goes into scaffolding. So these are biomaterials that house the cells. These could be fiber-based, sponge-based, other kinds of carriers for cells, all to give more texture to the foods you're making, and the examples are on the right. So these are all things, there's many companies out there looking at different parts of this process. So some are focusing on just the scaffolding surface materials, others are focusing on bioreactor technology development, and others are focused on cell line engineering to make these overall processes move ahead. And then the other question is, how do these foods taste? Because there are many companies making products. As you may be tracking this, I think there are now 7 approved products worldwide, at least 4 in the US, a couple in Singapore, and so on. As a group, we have been fortunate to taste almost all of them now. I would say overall they taste really good. There's always room for improvement in some. You see, for example, salmon produced by Wild Type out of San Francisco, where they isolated cells from the fish and cultivate them into the kinds of textures and visual appeal you see here. Tastes really good. Chicken, obviously that's from chicken fibroblasts that are cultivated for good meats. And on the right, Mission Barns recently received approval in the US, and they make everything from meatballs and bacon and so on. Their technology is based on pig fat cells, if I remember, about 10% cell mass within a plant-based structure. So a good example of a hybrid food to achieve really high-end flavor and taste and texture at hopefully a cost-competitive process. So these products are now starting to become more available now that they've been getting through regulatory hurdles. If it's not clear to the audience, in the US at least, the companies had to go through 2 barriers for approval, meaning 2 rounds of data documentation and safety assessments to make sure they're good for consumption. Both our Department of Agriculture and our Food and Drug Administration have to check off and sign off on these foods. So you see example of Mission Barns meatball on the left and Upside Foods chicken on the right. These have been through the process. I've tried them all. They're really good. Not yet scaled to be in the supermarket, right? But available in restaurants periodically today for consumers to try. I think that's back to you, Julian.
Great, thanks very much, David. I'll go through some of these quite quickly, just so we've got more time for questions at the end. So we've talked about, all of these different sources of proteins that can be alternatives to meat. And each one of them has got their own advantages and disadvantages. So for example, plant-based proteins are often relatively inexpensive and they're very abundant. Whereas, the lab-grown meat is, it's very much more closely mimics real meat in terms of nutrition and flavor and appearance, but it's much more expensive to produce and much more difficult to scale. So I think these hybrid meat analogues will combine the benefits of different types of protein sources in order to make a product that is healthier and more desirable to consumers. And again, to do that, there's lots of different things you need to think about when you combine these different ingredients together. We've got to make sure that they've got good sensory properties. If they don't taste good, nobody's going to eat them. They've got to be safe to consume. They've got to meet all the regulatory aspects that David was talking about. And ideally, they should have a good nutritional profile. So they should have the right nutrients in, but they should also have beneficial effects on digestibility and on the gut microbiome. I'll just give you a couple of examples of some of the recent work we did in our lab. And this is just really preliminary work where we were trying to blend different types of alternative protein sources together to make hybrid foods. This example, we just blended a sort of mushrooms and potato proteins together. And we measured a whole series of different properties, like what they looked like, what their mechanical properties were, what their cooking properties were. And just to show here, this is a sort of gel strength versus sort of pure potato protein, then potato protein plus mushroom. And you can see that just by adding mushroom, you can make these harder products, which is going to change the mouthfeel and the consumer acceptance. And what we're trying to do is, on the fundamental level, understand what causes those changes. And just give you another example, this is where we used sort of mushrooms with whey protein. So the only difference between the last set of experiments was we used potato protein last time and a milk protein this time. But now when we add these mushrooms in, you get a big decrease in the Young's modulus, or the gel strength. So completely different effects. So I think, it's a very simple experiment, but just shows that we really don't understand what determines the physiochemical sensory properties of these hybrid products. It's difficult to predict from the different ingredients what's going to happen when we blend them together. So I think it highlights the need that we need much more research in this area to understand it at the fundamental level. So ideally, we need to develop some rational design principles where we understand that these are very complicated materials that are made of many different components that can interact with each other. And we need to understand what these different ingredients are, what are the molecular interactions involved, and how that changes the spatial organization, the mechanical strength and appearance and mouthfeel of these kind of products. So this is an area where I'd really encourage more people to work in the future. And there's different scientific approaches we can take to try and understand these complicated materials. Probably the most common one is just a sort of trial and error approach, where we treat a food as a black box, so we don't really try to understand what's happening in these hybrid products. We just vary some inputs, like the type of ingredients we have, the amounts of ingredients, the kind of processes we apply to those ingredients, and then we measure some outputs. So does it taste good? What's the nutritional profile and things like that. And I think this is probably the most common approach that's used in industry at the moment. And that's not surprising because these are incredibly complicated materials. I think we can go one step further and we can start applying some artificial intelligence tools. So I'm a scientific advisor for a company in California that uses artificial intelligence to optimize the properties of plant-based cheese products. And they will use like an AI model where you can feed in all the different inputs, you can feed in all the different outputs, and then you can try and relate them to each other. And this can help optimize your product formulation. So you can find out what's the best ingredients to get the final products, like something that tastes good, it's got the best nutritional profile, it's got the best microbiome effects. So I think these are increasingly being used in this industry at the moment, especially for these complex hybrid products. Another approach that academics often use is we try and understand at a fundamental level what's going on using mathematical models and physical theories. So in our lab, we've done a lot of work trying to use like polymer science models or physics models to try and understand if you blend different ingredients together, how does that affect things like the gel strength and the appearance? And we can make some progress with this and it helps us understand what's going on, but it's very challenging because these models often assume you've got like spheres in a polymer matrix, where in foods, you've got hundreds of different ingredients with different sizes, shapes, and interactions. And that makes it very challenging. And the other approach that we try to use is computational models. It's trying to look at the molecular level. What are the different features of proteins and polysaccharides and fats that determine their interactions with each other? and how that affects the kind of structures that are formed, and then try and correlate that to things like their texture or their appearance. And again, I think that there's a lot more work to be done in this area. And again, I'd encourage people who are interested in this area to use these kinds of approaches. So now I'll pass it over to David, and he'll talk about some of these really important aspects like the life cycle analysis models.
Thank you, Julian. I'll be pretty brief so we stay on schedule. But aside from the molecular level kinds of interactions and modeling that Julian just talked about, we also want to look at a systems level approach to these alternative proteins and future foods. And to do that, there are a lot of strategies people use, mostly related to things like life cycle analysis, and others are techno-economic assessments and models. And the goal really is to look at all the inputs and all the outputs that come through these processes. And in doing so, identify, number one, where are the weak points or the pain points that could be a focus for the research, like Julian just talked about, to improve that part of the process to make sure overall this is going to be a cost-effective and sustainable process, et cetera. And so a lot of this is really understanding for inputs here. For example, you see on this sourcing. So what are all the raw ingredients that go into this? For example, the amino acids, and what's the cost to get those into the bioreactor? How do we make biomaterials, cell carriers to fit into these equations? Finally, what goes on in that tank, right, to make sure all the metabolism is accounted for? What are all the process controls and how costly are those? And then finally, the final product that you're going to produce. Are you 3D printing? Are you doing the hollow fiber approach that we talked about before, and so on? So this is all about inputs, inventory, quantifying energy costs and amounts and available supplies, and what the long-term, short-term looks like. The good news is models are happening in our own program, for example, led by Professor Nicole Blackstone and one of my students, Kirsten Trinidad. So we're starting to generate data, as are other labs around the world. The bad news is we still don't have a lot of scaled data from real world production systems, and we need that real data to feed the models to get better, accurate estimates of cost of production, what the electrical energy costs are going to be, how do we use renewable energy to keep those costs down, how much water, et cetera, et cetera. So we're making good progress through a lot of fundamental research, but for the companies online and anybody that can provide scaled data that we can feed into these models for the field of alt proteins, this will be value added to where we're going. And the other brief thing I wanted to mention, all this leads to, and Julian mentioned this, if it doesn't smell good and taste good, nobody's going to want it anyway. So we have to spend a lot of time on what are these foods that we're talking about today? What are they like when the consumer actually tries them? So for example, led by Emily Liu in our group, she's done a lot of work on taking pork fat that's grown in a lab, comparing it to pork fat you'd buy in a butcher shop, for example, and doing all the biochemical analysis, which you see on the bottom left of this slide, to compare the fatty acid profiles and how similar they actually are. And then we go through cooking and smelling tests with the students to evaluate, does it smell as good as the real thing, if you will? And so far, so good. Generally, all the outcomes look like if you grow cells up, for example, in a laboratory environment, apart from the whole animal, they actually come out fairly similar to what you see when it's grown from the whole animal. So this is just the beginning of a lot of sensory work that all the labs, the research needs to be done to compare this, as well as the taste testing using consumer panels and other evolving technologies as well. I think
so just to sort of wrap up, I think what we've talked about so far is trying to use alternative protein sources to create meat analogs, so something that looks, feels, tastes, and behaves just like real meat. And I think part of one of the challenges with doing that is, meat and plants are so different, and these other protein sources are so different, and that often means that we need lots and lots of ingredients and lots of processing. But there's also other types of proteins that we could protein-based foods we could make. There's things like tofu and seitan and tempeh, which are already widely established around the world, and we can make products like that from these alternative protein sources. Or we can also create a whole series of new products that doesn't even exist at the moment. So we could create something that's rich in proteins, rich in fiber, but it doesn't vitamins and minerals, but it doesn't have to look or taste like real meat. So it could be like a yellow triangle or a red sphere or a purple hexagon. So, you know, we can just use our imagination to create all sorts of different protein-rich, nutritious products. And then this means that we could use less ingredients and less processing. The only challenge now is, like, if we try and reinvent these future foods, will people actually eat them? And I think people have what's called neophobia. They don't want to try new things. I think if we can make them, if we can encourage them to try some of these products, this may be an alternative to try and make meat analogs and other products. So just to finish up the talk, I think the old paradigm for the food industry was to focus on taste, cost, and convenience, because these are three of the most important aspects that make foods commercially viable. But I think that has led to a lot of sort of unhealthy, sort of highly processed food products. And that's led to chronic diseases like obesity, heart disease, cancers, and things like that. So I think in the future, and also sustainability issues. So I think the new paradigm in the future is we've got to still make sure foods taste, cost, and taste good, and that they're inexpensive and they're convenient. But also we've got to take into account things like ethics and resilience and health and sustainability. And I think these need to be taken into account right when we're designing foods at the beginning. I think if we're making these hybrid food products, it's important that we do this when we're trying to design them. And I think that's the end of our talk. So we're very happy to answer any questions with the rest of the panel. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, David. Fascinating to hear details, especially on how the cultured cell-based proteins are actually produced, because I didn't really know about that. So it's really fascinating engineering, great engineering. I'm very jealous that you got to eat them, because I would really love to try them. I'm also glad that you mentioned there, Julian, about the idea of novel proteins that don't necessarily reflect meat. You know, my mum often says when I do programs about this, she says, you know, I don't want my alternative protein sources to look or taste of meat, right? So, but as you say, that is what the majority of consumers want. I'm going to introduce the three panelists who are going to come and join us for the Q&A. First up, Professor Kai Purnhagen is Professor of Law and Director of the Research Centre for German and European Food Law at the University of Bayreuth in Germany. Kai's research focuses on the intersection of law, science and policy to address challenges in food safety, quality and innovation. And through his leadership at the Research Centre, he advances interdisciplinary approaches to legal frameworks governing the food sector, contributing to both scholarly knowledge and practical regulatory improvements. Kai regularly serves as an advisor to various governments and consulting agencies such as the Chinese government, the European Commission, the European Parliament, the German government and the Austrian government as well. So it's a pleasure to have him join us today. Alongside Kai will be Dana Wilson, the Research and Engagement Manager at the FAIRR Initiative in the United Kingdom, a global investor network of over 400 members with $80 trillion in combined assets. Dana leads the Protein Diversification Engagement Team, so driving collaboration between investors and major food companies to accelerate this transition towards healthy, sustainable and diversified protein portfolios. Before joining FAIRR, Dana worked with the UK government's Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs on animal health and welfare policy. And alongside her background researching cell-cultivated leather, which I was interesting to read about, she brings deep scientific and policy expertise to advancing alternative proteins and mitigating sustainable risks in global food systems. Thank you very much for joining us, Dana. And our final guest panelist is Dr. Dariush Ajami, the Chief Innovation Officer at Beyond Meat in the US. At Beyond Meat, Dariush leads cutting-edge research and development to advance plant-based protein technologies. With a PhD in food science and extensive experience in ingredient innovation, Dariush plays a pivotal role in creating sustainable, nutritious and delicious alternatives to animal-based products, driving Beyond Meat's mission to transform the global food system. Thank you very much, Dariush, for joining us. A warm welcome to all panelists who I hope are with us now. Yes, I can see you all. So as we've heard, let me put a question first to each of our joining panelists, as we've just heard from Julian and David in detail. Kai, maybe your policy outlook that I trailed earlier as part of the hub, it highlights that hybrid products introduce an additional layer of complexity because they combine ingredients that may trigger overlapping requirements. So, for example, labeling challenges for plant components, alongside demanding pre-market authorization for novel components like cultivated cells. So, what do you think is the most significant shortcoming of traditional regulatory frameworks in the face of this complexity? And also tell us about the idea of a regulatory sandbox and how that might help. Over to you.
Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for the invitation, for this amazing presentation that we've seen. It's a good introduction to everyone, including me being a lawyer. I think I finally understood what I'm talking about. So thank you very much for that. Now, coming back to the question, well, it's also been well said by both of them before. The communication is the major issue. So the uncertainty is not only on the side of the applicants, but also on the side of the regulators. And therefore, those systems that actually provide for mechanisms for where communication between regulators and regulatees can be enabled, those have proven to be the most successful ones. So we've seen in the US, we've seen in Singapore, we've also seen that in China. And those who tend to, have a traditional application recipient system that tend to be more innovation unfriendly and also take longer for this action. So I don't think that the approval procedure itself is a problem. It's more the way how to handle it, how to handle the communication.
Interesting. Thank you. Something I'm sure we'll pick up on in a second. Dana, welcome. Our other policy outlook, written by your colleague at the FAIRR Initiative, stresses the need for transformative finances and supportive policy frameworks to kind of tackle, it was a striking $12 trillion of hidden costs I was reading of the conventional food system. Tell us where that figure comes from, and also what interventions could be put in place to ensure that these hybrid protein innovations are affordable.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, David and Julian, for the insightful presentation at the start of this session as well. The UN FAO is the evaluator for that $12 trillion hidden cost of food, and this includes environmental, social, and health impacts that are not reflected in the price of food. So as David and Julian highlighted in their section, a significant portion of this cost, around $8 trillion US dollars, is linked to unhealthy dietary patterns and non-communicable disease risk like heart disease and diabetes. And many of the audience will be familiar with the Eat Lancet's recent updated Healthy, Sustainable and Just Food Systems guidelines, which found that food is the single largest driver of 5 planetary boundary breaches as well. In terms of making food more affordable, it's important for national food strategies to holistically consider these planetary boundaries across climate, nature, as well as health and social aspects. Although many national dietary guidelines, around 88% globally, already encourage greater intake of plant-based foods to reduce diet-related disease risk, translating this into implementation does require enabling policies, as the majority of companies are currently falling short of plant-based consumption recommendations. So, for example, strengthening public catering procurement policies to encompass healthier, more sustainable proteins is an option, such as the New York Plant-Rich Hospital Catering Scheme, which saw success in recent years. And another consideration, although politically sensitive, is taxation policy, as right now in the UK, for example, many basic foods such as raw meat, fish and vegetables are all taxed at 0% rate, but this does not consider nudging towards benefits in terms of environmental or health outcomes, where sugar taxation policies have seen early successes recently, for example. And we've also seen Denmark announced an early example of an emissions tax to be implemented from 2030. But this will significantly impact livestock farmers, and support provisions have not necessarily been considered to help them transition to more sustainable practices. So we do need to think of the potential trade-offs when these new policies are brought in.
Such great points. Thank you, Dana. Dariush, welcome. lots to talk to you about Beyond Meat. I mean, you are at the forefront of the plant-based food sector. Julian explained how plant-based products can be engineered to recreate the texture and the mouthfeel of meat. What can you share? Can you share with us kind of some of how you go about doing that? And then also, just to kind of riff off what Dana was saying and what we were saying earlier, how can you handle the challenge of achieving price parity with conventional meat as well?
Sure, Greg. It's always pleasure to listen to Julian and David, presentation. These guys pushing the frontier of science forward, and we really appreciate all the great work that they do in industry, not only developing new technologies, but also training the next generation of the leader that we need in industry. So thank you. I mean, Julian and David did a great job of, showing how complex it is, developing something that resembles the texture, the fattiness, the juiciness, the flavor, the color of the, animal meat. But, the meat, it's a muscle tissue, it's been evolved for its protein to package in a rod-like, structure to support bone movements and with expanding and contracting. From the other side, the plant protein that we use are seed protein mainly, and they're also evolved to occupy small space, very, packaged, very packed and dense structure. So, and 1.0 texture, as Julian mentioned, is, using heating, cooling, and pressure to open up that dense protein structure and cool it in something that resembles that fibrous morphology of the animal meat texture. So Beyond Meat is, Pioneer is one of the few companies in the field that does that, internally. And this is why we are not relied on only one single source of protein. We use diverse source of protein from yellow pea to brown rice, ground faba, and, more. But then the 2.0 texture, again, as was discussed, is, using the scaffold, as David mentioned, and, putting, the nutrition in that scaffold. And one good example is mycelium. Mycelium could create that, beautiful scaffold. And that's what also Beyond Meat taking advantage in the whole muscle steak that we have developed using mycelium to create that texture. So again, that's only one part. It gets to the, juiciness, the fat, the fat adipose in the meat is, it's the fat is compartmentalized, into units, while you can use, plant fat on a structure, but the result will not be the same. So this is why structure fat using emulsion, as they mentioned, is pivotal and very important. And it goes on and on, how the flavors and so forth. So still there's a gap. This is why we need new technologies. It's we need to improve all these criteria, from texture, from the juiciness, fattiness, improve the flavor, the color transition, and so forth. So.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Let's just pick up on that. We've had a load of questions from viewers asking about particular types of technology that could help, say, the texture, could help the binding of the different meat products. I'm looking at there's a whole long list here. But Julian, let me just ask you this. Mohammed Rashidi Ismail Fitri asks about high pressure processing. Could that help the binding and the texture? Raki Rachel Ryan asks about kind of how you deal with shear gelation. There's so many different challenges and bits of technology that people are talking about here. And I know we've already covered quite a few, but just give me like bullet points. Give me 3 that you're particularly excited about that you think, as Dariush said, could take us to 2.0 or even 3.0.
Yeah, just before saying that, and just, just to show how complicated it is, imagine if you were trying to make like a meat-based fruit product. So if you try to make like an apple out of beef, it would be almost impossible to do. So I think, the fact that people like, Beyond Meat and Impossible Food have actually made burgers that look like meat from plants is pretty incredible, because you couldn't make an apple from, beef or pork. So Yeah, so what kind of technologies? I think, I mean, I think these soft matter physics approaches have got some advantages because you can use less energy and less ingredients. So that's really understanding at the molecular level what's happening and how these different molecules interact with each other. So you can get things called like phase separation, and then you can make fibrous structures based on that. But I think any new technologies, you know, like high pressure processing could work, but I think it tends to be more of a batch operation, and it's more difficult to make larger amounts of food. You know, people are looking at things like sonication and other kind of methods as well. So I think there's all sorts of technologies, and I think it's just up to your imagination to see what's actually working, what can work and is economically feasible.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you know, as Dariush was saying, it's about combining them. And David was talking about, you know, the scaffolding methods. I found that fascinating with the hollow fibers and all those sorts of things. But let me get to, I guess, the nub of one big area of questions that I've seen coming in, and that's around the nutritional content. So I guess our health, and then also planetary health. So let's explore them in order. Let's start. I'll put this question to you, David. Sabika Arif says, how can we ensure that plant-based meats provide all the essential nutrients and proteins found in animal-based meats? And I suppose that's one of the key things. You know, I started in my introduction saying that we can't really get one that does everything, hence the notion of hybrid. But maybe just unpack that for us a little bit, David, and how we can make a product that covers the full nutrient range that meat offers.
Yeah, I think the general feeling, strategy, et cetera, is that's why cells, whether they're animal cells, fungal cells, bacteria, become really important in hybrid products, right? Because a lot of the nutritional content comes from cells, whether it's specific essential amino acids, lipids, things like this, where it's, I would just say, by current technology, perhaps more difficult to get directly in plant-based products. So you have to add all sorts of things in. And people want less additives. People want simpler, less processed materials. So I think tightening in, you know, the right ratios of the right kinds of cells with the right kinds of nutrients, with the right kinds of plant products will give us a bunch of different sort of equations that you can start to mix and match. And really, you have to start to think about what's the product goal you have and what do you want that nutrition, taste, and sensory profile to be, and then you work backwards. And that's where, for example, Julian mentioned AI and other tools. We need to bring all those into, you know, what are those ingredients? How do you put them together in the right way at the right time with as minimum processing as you can to get that nutrition, flavor, and taste out? I think if you look where we were 5 years ago and a year ago, I think the progress is remarkable. And that's because of labs, you know, like that study the fundamentals of plants like Julian's, but married to the companies like Beyond Meat and others that really are trying to make products. And we just feed in the cell-based data and the plant-based data to help them. So I think we're on a great trajectory. We have a long way to go still, but the variables and the control points are infinite. And that makes me very confident we'll figure out the right way to turn those knobs to get the right products out as we move forward, safer, healthier, and so on.
You mentioned just twice there when you were talking about the kind of driver to make them less processed, and I wonder if I could pick this up with you, Dariush. You know, the buzzword at the moment is ultra processed food, UPF. You know, everyone being advised to limit the amount of UPF in their diet. There's a whole conversation we could have about the definition about the application of that. But what's your feeling as you know, there's a lot of processing. You know, Beyond Meat products, they are, as are all these products, they are ultra processed. So how do you navigate this challenge?
Yeah, I mean, you know, here's how we think about it. You know, for us, processing is a tool. You know, you can use advanced technology and, you know, latest engineering and use something that has little nutritional value, tastes great, which is not good. From the other side, you know, you can use technology, you know, again, you know, the latest advancement and improve nutrition, reduce fat, you know, find a way to add fiber, manage sodium, you know, in different way. So for us is, you know, of course, you know, we always want to have a smart process, but, you know, we want to be transparent. You know, we always talk about the process that we use, heating, cooling, pressure, shear, and so forth. But we, you know, we look and monitor nutrition value at every step of the process too, you know. For us, we rely on measure outcome, not just intention. When we were a small startup, 2017, we started collaborating with the Stanford Medicine, Chris Gardner lab, where they did a swap meat study in a randomized 8 weeks study when the panelists will eat meat for 8 weeks and then replace it with plant-based or vice versa, and the results are wonderful. In that short study, the LDL and TMO, which are marker for cardiovascular diseases, you could see huge benefit when you use beyond product. So in general is one thing, of course, at this age, we need to use processes to increase nutritional value, to have food security and so on. But then from the other side, the outcome should be look at it. We need to do more clinical studies. These clinical studies are not cheap. Companies and again, when we did that and we continue doing that with the Stanford Medicine and others, we gift in a way that we are not in a process, the outcome is not influenced by ours. But it would be even better for consumer, to all of these studies to be funded by government around the world. Bigger clinical study, everyone that is, in this sector, their intention is to improve human health. And, the more bigger clinical study will help us to navigate, to develop products that are better than what we have been consuming before too. So what if, you could use technology to make something that is more nutritional, even cheaper, and more accessible. So that's the way that we look at it.
Yeah, absolutely fair. I think that this term UPF is a catch-all for a heck of a lot of different a lot of products that yes do maybe on the whole have nutritional challenges, but it also encapsulates a lot of products that don't necessarily. And I think we will need in the near future to refine our terms and create some nuance in the term UPF. And but also interesting, Dana said this in your first question. You said about the clear link between plant-based foods and a smaller impact on our health. I want to get onto planetary health as well in a second, but first, just to spin off what Dariush said about, I guess, making a just transition to these novel proteins. I think I'll put this to you, Kai, and then come to Dana for comment. What do you think are the key factors, Kai, especially around the legal and policy frameworks that are kind of needed to support a just transition to novel proteins?
Well, we have to make it possible for each type of company, including from the innovators, the small scale company up to the big ones, to at least get an access to the market and at least get a possibility to go through a predictable authorization procedure. So costs, length of procedures, and particularly also the horizon of the people who provide the money is an important issue. So lowering down approval procedure times, allowing for communication between the different regulatory agencies. This is the two major factors which would contribute to this, so that ultimately also smaller companies can have a chance to go through the market.
Yeah, so as you say, it's the regulatory process, but also the financial side. And Dana, I think you can comment to this. What are the financial, what are the ethical, the social kind of equity aspects of transitioning a food system?
It's a great question. I think it's often neglected in the conversation on how are affected stakeholders going to be supported in this transition to more sustainable food systems, which we know we have to collectively make. And this is why, as part of our protein diversification engagement, we do assess just transition as a pillar. So thinking about how companies are, it may be financing, or it may be reskilling, redeploying workers. Most companies right now are focused on regenerative agriculture and how to support suppliers to shift to more sustainable practices in that sense. And generally, the implications of dietary shift and protein diversification are overlooked at the moment. Danone, for example, has given one example of reskilling its workers in a previously dairy factory to produce oat milk in line with increased market demand. That's at their Villacrompton site in France. It's quite an interesting early example. But there's also a key role for governments here, and how can they support affected stakeholders as well to integrate more sustainable practices and perhaps diversify farming models. And the UK's reform of agricultural subsidies since leaving the European Union to reward environmental and animal welfare outcomes over land use was an encouraging starting point in this. And of course, there's more policies that could be brought in going forwards too.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting about the reskilling and also, you know, the need to kind of diversify farming models. Thank you, Dana. On to planetary health then. I said we'd cover this. Firstly, thank you, CM Collins, for that previous question. On to planetary health. So loads of questions here. Let me kind of try to put some of them together. So Christina asks, and Adrian and David Thaler, they're asking about are these highly processed foods, such as plant-based milk and plant-based meat, definitely environmentally friendlier than animal-based products? I feel like some of the stats have been shared on that already. But Adrian asks about we need to consider the allergenicity, his word, not mine, what a word, and physiological impact of these new products, of these new matrices. Is that something, David, that people are looking at?
Yes, on all fronts. I think very active programs looking at what's the impact of these kinds of foods on human health, right? And there are different ways to do this. There are certainly ways you could do animal feeding studies. There are certainly ways you could do consumer consumption evaluations if there's enough product. And then there's a lot of interest in using what I would call the evolution into in vitro, so non-animal related tissue models for human health and screening there. So I think there's a whole wave of what I would call a new generation of tools being developed by different labs to really provide more quantitative data on all these kinds of questions. So for now, there's enough data in all the regulatory packages provided in terms of nutrition content and so on, to at least in the US, to USDA and FDA, that anyone could go look at as well.
Okay, great. Yes, I mean, you've got to keep up on speed and quality on that, haven't you? Otherwise, you're never going to bring a product to market, let alone to kind of trials. And you shared the life cycle analyses earlier that showed kind of the environmental impact of these relative different products. I see an interesting question while we're talking about kind of personal impact. I see an interesting question on individualized nutrition. Since evidence suggests that the same diet isn't optimal for everyone. Julian, you were talking earlier about there are all these different technologies, but the key one is finding something that you can essentially make in bulk, right? And we've got to cross that bridge first. But do you think in the future there may be an opportunity, if we're manufacturing these products, that we could personalize them as well?
Yeah, and I think there's a big area in the personalized nutrition area, and like trying to combine that with things like 3D printing or additive manufacturing. You can imagine, like at home, you could almost have like the coffee machine now where you put in your little carton. You could put in like 4 different little things they've got different nutrients in, or proteins and polysaccharides and stuff, and then depending on your personal nutrition needs, you press a button and it 3D prints that particular food with the taste, the texture, the nutritional profile that you need for yourself. But whether that's actually going to be economically feasible or viable in the future, I don't know. But it's good for like people who grew up with Star Trek.
Yeah, it's a fun idea. It's a fun idea.
Yeah.
I mean, even before we get to that point, we need to get to the point where, as you say, it's economically feasible. Before that, we've got to get to the point where there's kind of wider public acceptance of these products. So, Dariush, what has been the journey to kind of public acceptance of beyond kind of plant-based products, and what do you think we're going to need to, what bridges do we need to cross for public acceptance for these hybrid-based products?
I mean, I again refer to Julian and David, the slides where, they were talking about the paradigms and, the health cost, and taste. Taste is always number one. Taste is king. All of these need to taste, as close as possible, or even better. It's there has been some recent study in Germany where they look at the cost range for meat alternative to be more attractive and bring more consumer to the field, and based on their result is the optimal range would be if the meat analogs are half of the price of the meat. So while we still have challenges even to get to the price parity. And then the health perspective, again, David also mentioned about cardiovascular diseases and cancer and so forth that some of the animal meat are associated with, and we could create something that is healthier too. When it gets to the hybrid, for us, at least for Beyond Meat, the cost of making hybrid, like adding mycelium to our process, increases because there are additional steps to do so. So we're using hybrid product to improve the taste and improve the health perspective, by using developing hybrid products like whole muscle steak, where it uses mycelium and plant protein. We creating a texture that is has a similar cutting experience like animal steak. From the other side, like we don't need to use traditional binder like methicellose while we are using these hybrids. So I hope that I answer your question.
Yeah, thanks, Cole. The engineering is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? And we're talking about these barriers that we need to break through, these bridges we need to cross. And Kai, you've talked a little bit to us already about the regulatory issue, the need for communication. I saw a couple of questions. One here: are regulatory institutions now requiring nutritional scoring data, such as DIAS, DIAAS, for approval or labeling? And Jal Silva asks about safety data sheets for new food proteins that need to enter the market. Are these things that people are needing to be really hot on? Are they having to evolve as well?
So the issue is, I can talk about the European regulatory system and a bit about the others, but we see, as I said, the same uncertainty on the side of the authorization organizations that we see on the side of the applicants. So the issue we have at the moment is there are no real guidelines for the data that is actually required. And what we've seen, for example, in one EFSA decision is that the EFSA basically said in the mycelium case, yes, it's a novel food, but it's similar to the fruiting body, so we don't require toxicology studies. So basically it says, yes, it's novel food, and yes, it's authorized. That was basically the requirements they had. So there's a lot of uncertainty in that respect, and that uncertainty is exactly shared in that respect. However, what is there, coming back to the original question also, we've seen some of the already approved products, such as, for example, insects. They usually resembles, for example, shrimps. So this testing requirements were the same that they had as with shrimps. And so at the moment, EFSA seems to try to get along with finding analogous products, but that means we still need regular, better guidelines in all respects. And sandboxes, just to come to the next point, would improve that, because during a sandboxing, which is something which precedes the authorization procedure, both could basically establish the common learning curves and basically agree on guidelines and testing mechanisms.
Just explain to us what a sandbox is. We had a few questions about that because I mentioned earlier, including from Savasti. What is a sandbox?
Yeah, thanks very much. Well, a sandbox is a confined environment under real-world conditions where specific regulatory requirements persist. So there's much more possible than there would be without authorization. There's still not everything possible with authorization, but it's basically one could look at it as a test field as for cars. So you try out different things, you try out consumers, you try out tastings, you try out several things, but at the same time, risks are being reduced through exposure to consumers. And so this is a learning curve and a communication area for authorization and for the respective authorities. The recent EU Biotech Act, which is at the moment under discussion, would foresee some of these sandboxing. And we all hope, I haven't seen the final approval at the moment, the final proposal, but we all hope that this will change the situation. And we all hope that once you've been through such a sandbox under supervision with the authorities, that afterwards your approval process will go much more smoothly.
Awesome. Thank you so much for explaining that. And really interesting to hear about, just the current regulatory frameworks. You're essentially taking an analogous product and kind of trying to port it across, which is going to be potentially help kind of efficiency and movement. But at the same time, there's so much there that you have to unpick because it is a novel product. Dana, if I may, I'd love to hear, you've got so many stats at your fingertips and this kind of great worldwide perspective. And I'd love to know a bit. We've got a question from Dr. Mizwenko Nala Mithania, who says about hybrid proteins. How can we make hybrid proteins sustainable in developing countries where populations are growing rapidly and demand for animal foods is high, but resources to produce hybrids are limited? Do we have a sense of the picture of kind of global north versus global south production impacts and concerns?
Thank you. It is an important question, and of course we don't just want these products to be available in more developed countries, and there needs to be accessibility in areas where there is perhaps undernutrition at the moment, as well as the issues of overnutrition in the West. There are some interesting financing mechanisms that could potentially support this. Canada so far has invested the most in plant-based protein production, and they've really focused on local manufacturing. And perhaps this is a policy model that could be translated to other areas. There's also potential here for sovereign wealth funds, and development banks could play a role in encouraging local production that benefits national economies in some of these growing regions as well. An early example of this, the European Investment Bank has provided loans to several plant-based and fermentation companies that align with the goals of the EU Farm to Fork. And this benefits companies as well by providing access to capital to address manufacturing scale-up before they might be eligible for broader funding pools, such as debt financing, that require a longer track record of cash flows, as right now the sector could be seen as riskier to invest in.
Thank you for that. Thanks for that perspective. Let's talk insects, because I've tried some of the insect-based products, and they're kind of nutty. They're kind of, there's something really interesting going on there. And you talked about the different textures, extrusion, etc., that can of course construct a kind of matrix how you wish from the insects. But it's really interesting. We've got a question here that asks, well, it puts them to you. It says, since insects currently do not outperform grain-based proteins on resource efficiency, how do you see them fitting into alternative proteins for human consumption? Can I put that to Julian or David, whichever of you would like to comment on the kind of, I guess it's the LCA position for insects and what that is now and what it could be in the near future?
Yeah, I don't know much about it, David. I mean, I've done a little bit of work with insects, and we tried some. Like, I went to my daughter's high school, and I took in like 2 snacks, and I had like a bag of crisps, or potato chips, and a bag of crickets. And I said, like, who wants to eat the unhealthy one, and who wants to eat the healthy stuff? And everyone said the healthy one, so I gave them the crickets, and they were really good. You know, the kids all ate them, and you know, they got it all stuck in the teeth and stuff. But
yeah, the kids are well up for it. I've done talks about kind of future food with kind of older audiences, and they're super up for it. Yeah, pass me the insects. But David, do we have stats? Kind of where do they fit in the, what is the LCA analysis of insects? Is this,
there is some
correct?
published work from our lab and others that basically would argue that insects are certainly more sustainable than traditional ways of producing other protein. For our own work, we've decided not, though, to pursue whole insects because there's a lot of challenges there with just the process and scaling. So we focus, as we talked about earlier, with isolating cells from the insects and then using those to grow biomass for food. And the insect cells themselves are very nutritious and very good that way. And therefore, they become an ingredient, and they they don't look like an insect anymore. So there's a value to that as well, because it gets around the consumer ick factor that Julian talked about. So I think there are many ways to go. The general premise with insects is they're easy to grow, lower cost to grow than traditional other sources of biology inputs to these foods. So there's value to looking at those further.
Yeah, absolutely. A really interesting point here, though. Someone said that many insect farming companies or products that have incorporated insect protein have struggled to achieve market acceptance compared to plant-based or cultivated products, with several leading producers shutting down in recent years. Given this track record, to what extent do we believe insects still have a viable role in the alternative protein landscape? Perhaps I can come to you, Dariush. Like, is this something you have considered or you would consider in the future? And if not, why not?
I mean, for Beyond Meat, we are consumer centric, and our consumer, they don't want us to use animal derived product at this point in our products. So we are staying true to plant-based, and then fungi, algae, yeast, addition to our plant-based. So it will be, fully, vegan plant-based product at this point. But there are lots of great work has been done, and I'm sure, others in industry will push this forward.
Yeah, I suppose that's the question. Do you feel, with your sense of, I appreciate you're plant-based, but do you think it's a sort of thing that with the environmental angle, with the ethical angle, do we think we could get?
Yeah, I mean, again, then all of this comes to the scale too. That's part of the cost parity as well too. You need to have very reasonable volume to figure out the processes, the step to make it more sustainable. One of the challenges for these new novel ingredients to say is some of it's regulatory in Europe or other area that it takes like 18 months to get the novel ingredients. But then from the other side, as was mentioned before, we need to do a study for allergenicity of novel ingredients and so forth to see how. But definitely, I think I'm sure there will be breakthrough, and someone will figure out how to incorporate those in food chain in the future.
I look forward to that. I think that'll be really interesting. I'd love to get your kind of final comments in just a second, but before that, a question to every single member of the panel with a very quick answer is this. John Ewan has asked, what has been your most memorable / favorite alt protein tasting that you've each had? I love that he said memorable, which means it doesn't necessarily need to be your best. So let's go around the group. Let's go for Julian first.
Yeah, I think it was the things I had in Denmark last year, the mycelium burgers. They were really good.
David?
Yeah, I would put out their Mission Barns with their meatballs. I thought they were really, really fantastic when I had them.
We're scribbling these all down to try. I am. Kai, have you tried some?
Well, tastings are not allowed in the European Union, but my crickets actually what I really liked. So they were really nutty. They really tasty.
There's also cricket pasta. There's things like what I was saying that's kind of hidden, so to speak. Dana, have you had the privilege of trying any of these?
Unfortunately, given the lack of regulatory approval in the UK, I've not tried cultivated yet, but I do quite enjoy the 3D printed steaks from Redefined Meat. I think they're quite an exciting texture.
Thank you. Dariush, I've got an idea what you're going to say.
Sure. Personally, I love the umami taste of the mycelium, and mycelium steaks are my favorite.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. We've pretty much run out of time. I've got a couple of minutes. So I'd just like to ask you each for your final point, what reflection would you like to leave viewers with? You've got 30 seconds to make your final points each. Dana, let's start with you.
Thank you. I think it has been brought up in the chat, but this isn't just about the actual nutritional quality, but also tackling mis and disinformation around these products will be key. And it has been classified as the highest risk by the World Economic Forum. So thinking about how we can incorporate hybrids on a staggered approach, such as secondary or tertiary ingredient substitution in the short term to get consumers familiar, I think will be key to the success in this industry.
Interesting. Thank you. Kai?
Yeah, stop letting yourself being influenced by risk and think about innovation, but it's the other way around. Let yourself influenced by innovation and think a bit about the risk.
Lovely, thank you. Dariush.
I just want everyone to consider that, this sector still is in its infancy, it's early days, it needs lots of innovation breakthrough in every aspect. So please, pay attention to this. And also, from the consumer's perspective, the sector also needs their support too.
Thank you. Julian.
Yeah, I think it's like a really, really important issue, like health and sustainability and environmental impact. So I think it's really important to work on it, but I think the science is really incredibly interesting and exciting to work on. So if I was a young scientist, this would be a fantastic area to work on. There's so many problems and challenges we need to address.
Yeah, absolutely. Here. David, please, final word.
Yeah, I think I'll build on Julian's comment. I think the technology we're all talking about today is here. It's not like we have to invent something new. We just need to figure out how to put it all together towards the goals we have. And I equate that to look at the advances over the last 100 years, whether it's communication, transportation, energy. We've made great progress there. Food and production hasn't changed at all in 1,000 years. So it's time to make these transitions. And now that we have the tools and we have the students, as Julia mentioned, I think the time is right.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much. What a fantastic session that has left me feeling rather hungry, I've got to say. So yeah, big thank you to all our speakers for joining me today. Thank you as well for joining us. Really appreciate it. Please do go visit the Frontiers in Science website to read the article that we've discussed today and to see all the related hub content. You can continue the conversation on social media using the hashtag Frontiers Forum. For now though, this is it from me and our guests, the entire team at Frontiers, who've been absolutely brilliant as always. Thank you so much and goodbye. Cheers, everyone.